we go. So remember, this is all in the context still of the Cold War, right? What's our main goal in the Cold War? Prevent countries from turning communist, which is called what? What's that foreign policy called? Containment. So stop the spread of communism. And we talked in our last unit about some of the ways we do that, right? The Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine, where we give money, or with China, where we gave war supplies. We talked about Korea, where we actually sent soldiers in. And so, with Korea being successful in protecting South Korea, when we see Vietnam escalating, the United States will turn to sending soldiers there as well. And so, if you look at this pathway that America's been going on since the 1960s, increasingly money is spent for containment, and it gets very expensive, right? Especially when the war escalates and there's 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, right? That gets very expensive. Our debt increases. So what's happening in Vietnam? Vietnam is split between North Vietnam, which is communist, and South Vietnam, which is anti-communist. And if you look at the pathway through the 1950s and 60s, in the 50s, we're giving money and supplies. And in the 60s, under JFK, what's his plan for Vietnam, or like what's his method or policy? Hold on. Okay. So JFK's policy is military advisors, right? Where they're sending a very small contingent of American soldiers to help with the South Vietnamese. That'll change though after Kennedy dies with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. What happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? They thought they were attacked. Okay, they thought it was the communists. And so what does that lead Lyndon B. Johnson to do? Okay, go to war, right? This is called escalation. Okay, they passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Which gives the president lots of power to fight in foreign wars. The big problem is for Johnson is escalating the war is going to lead to a very expensive war, right? And Johnson is already spending a lot of money on something else. What's that something else? It's not a foreign policy, it's a domestic policy. Of the Great Society. Okay, so Great Society had two goals. One, fight racial injustice. So a lot of the things we talked about in the last unit, like the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, that's part of the Great Society. But also fight poverty, right? Over a fifth of Americans are impoverished. And so his programs are going to try to help them, right? It's a war on poverty. Programs like Medicare and Medicaid, giving health care to those who are unemployed or impoverished, or to those who are retired. stuff like Head Start, free preschool programs for children, right? The thing is, all of this is expensive. So the issue we're going to see is that we have two very expensive things happening at the same time, right? Johnson hopes that the war is going to last not very long, so the soldiers can come back and all that money can go to the Great Society. However, we know that the war doesn't end quickly. It drags on. And so because the war gets so expensive and Johnson doesn't want to give it up to the communists, this is going to take away a lot of the Great Society programs. And so there's funding issues, there's funding questions. Where are we going to get the money for all of this? Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about the actual fighting in Vietnam. We don't need to know necessarily battles, although there aren't necessarily battles like in World War II in Vietnam, right? In a lot of cases, American soldiers are looking for the Viet Cong, which are the communist rebels who use like guerrilla tactics, who use ambushes, who use traps to kill Americans or to stop them. And things get really difficult with the 1968 Tet Offensive, which remember is when the communists secretly attacked all at once on the same day, at the same time, over 100 different cities in South Vietnam. And while it was a victory on the battlefield, they were able to push the communists back. How was it received at home? That we should end the war. Why? Like, what's the big, like, why does this lead to people not maybe supporting the war anymore? Okay, president could be lying, right? So far, the president said, "Oh, the war is almost over. The communists are going to surrender soon," and people are like, "Well, this doesn't seem like that's true," and so it leads to the credibility gap, or it adds to it. Right? This idea that the president could be lying about how well the war is going. And so it changed opinions about the war. Many began to oppose the war. For the first time, surveys showed that more Americans were against the war than supported the war. And so it's clear by this time for the rest of the year that Johnson is not going to win the presidency, so he doesn't even run. And instead, Nixon is going to win. Nixon is going to run on kind of a against the handling of the war, but he's also against the protesters. Calls himself a law and order candidate, right? Which is kind of funny after what we just learned in chapter 27, what he does. Nixon will many times argue he is working for the silent majority, who are people who support our troops. Maybe they don't like how the war has been handled, but they support what we're doing in Vietnam. They support containing communism, but they avoid protests. In many cases, they don't like protesters at all. Like we talked about the survey after what happened at Kent State, and where it showed a majority of Americans sided with the National Guard for shooting into an unarmed crowd of students because they were protesting. Right. So Nixon is elected, and his plan to end the war is Vietnamization. return the responsibility for the fighting to South Vietnam. Okay, so, okay, South Vietnam, this is your fight, this is your war. We're gonna give you more responsibility. We'll keep training you and everything, but we're slowly gonna back out and transfer responsibility over to you. 68. However, it's a very slow transition, right? It's been a couple years now since he was elected, and they're still fighting in Vietnam. In fact, Americans will begin to find out that the fighting has expanded into places like Laos and Cambodia, right? The secret war that we talked about in class. And so many Americans, especially young people, will protest this, right? This is where we see the protest at Kent State and the shootings that happened there. And so we're going to continue to turn over responsibility. Numbers of American soldiers will continue to decrease in the 1970s, and eventually America will leave and Vietnam will turn completely communist. One effect after the war, we see Congress passes the War Powers Act, which gives Congress the ability, like, back the power for war, and it's limiting the powers of the president. They'll also make a new amendment to the Constitution that we didn't take notes on. You don't need to remember it for our test. But they changed the voting age. Now, 18-year-olds can vote. The idea is if an 18-year-old could be drafted to fight in a war, they should be able to vote as well. Okay. I think that's all I got for Vietnam. Any questions about that at all? Okay. Any other generalized questions from your study guide on Unit 8? We're good? Okay.